Hello, hi, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. My name is Lacey, and this week we're going to be taking a break from fluid painting and we're going to be exploring watercolor. This is actually a class that I teach locally in northern Colorado, but if you'd like to try this at home, you can follow along with this video in order to make a beautiful misty kind of mountain silhouette using a few basic washes. Gradient washes as well as flat washes. So the very first thing we need to do is go ahead and mix up our colors. The supplies you're going to need for this tutorial are some watercolor paper, at least 140 pound, something hard to tape your paper down to, therefore some masking tape. You'll need some sort of a palette where you can actually mix your colors. I primarily only use a size 12 watercolor brush, some watercolor paints. I'm using tube paints, both core and shin hand, some water, something to wipe your brushes off with, and I suggest a pipette. For my background sky of my mountains, I want this to be the magical time of night when the sun is setting and there are some beautiful colors in the sky. The sky right on the horizon of the mountains is almost white, a little yellow, and maybe there's a little pink. So I'm going to mix up a nice yellow, mixing a couple different yellows because I don't want a bright yellow. And then I want a pretty bright pink, but I'm going to really water that down. So go ahead and mix those colors up. And for those first colors you mix, you want them to be the most pigmented that you might want anything on your painting. Then I want you to put a few drops of water in one of the palette pots next to it. And I want you to add the pigment of your one you just mixed directly to that water so that you have a very muted version of the color, or a very translucent version of the color. We're going to need both a dark pink, a lighter pink, some extra water, and then the same for the yellow. You'll see here I test and test again. You always want to have a scrap of watercolor paper next to you so you can actually test what the real color is, because you can always add more pigment, you can always adapt, and it's going to look a lot different on the paper than it does in your little paint pot. Once you have your second versions of your first colors mixed, or the muted versions, put a little bit of water in another segment so that it's just clean, clear water. And then we're going to actually start this gradient wash. We're going to cheat a little bit because we're not going to gradient into two different colors. We're just going to do one at a time, and that's kind of the easy way to start this. So what we would do is you pick up a ton of water in your brush, and you're going to be holding your backing board at an angle so that as the water sits, it falls down and it doesn't pool. And with each line, you want to make sure that you keep that reservoir of water and go straight back and forth across the paper. And as you move down, you start dipping your brush into the clear water. And that's going to move us from a slightly darker pink to a lighter pink. And you do that all the way across. So maybe for the first 5 or 6 rows, you use the middle pink because I want mine to be very light. I'm not sure I want to use that initial pink that I painted with, or that I mixed up. And then I want to start from the middle. I want to start from the second pink, paint 5 or 6 rows, and then dab my brush into the water for each subsequent one, and that's going to slowly reduce the amount of pigment remaining in your brush. You don't want to stick your brush into that water and really swirl it around, because then there will be a very harsh line of transition. When you reach the bottom of the page, dry your brush off and use it kind of like a little sponge right along the bottom to soak up any excess water. And then our next step, this is going to be one step that we repeat over and over again, is to wait until this is completely dry. You can use a hair dryer to force this once there are no visible wet spots. After making sure this is dry, you have a decision point. Do you like the wash? Was it dark enough? If it is, and if you're happy with it, you can skip this next one, but I personally thought that my pink wasn't pigmented enough, so I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing again, because we're going to build the pigment layers, and I'm just going to make sure that I have a little bit more visible pink and a good transition here. So we start with the pigmented pink, and we add tiny bits of water as we go down. You can technically repeat this step as many times as you want, as long as you wait between layers for it to completely dry. So this is not a one and done thing. You can get your background exactly how you want it. This is a little bit hard to see because the video washes this out a bit, but there is a very light pink gradient that starts from the top here. And how we're going to cheat this is we're going to flip it over, and now we're going to work on it the opposite way. So we're going to do our yellow, because I want the yellow to be coming up from the bottom of this painting and the pink to be coming from the top, and I want this kind of middle area where they are both pretty translucent, but they kind of mix together. So we'll start by filling our brush up with that second yellow pigment, and then we will do a few rows using that second yellow pigment, and then we start to add little bits of water. So again, we're transitioning from a yellow to almost a clear by the time we get to the very bottom of this sheet. And then the most crucial part of this step is to wait for this to completely dry before you move on to the next step. Again, at this stage you can choose to whether to move on to the actual next step or to repeat this same step. I've chosen to repeat it because I want a little more pigment again. I always like to work in less vibrant colors initially for these very gradual fades, just because I'd rather get to the actual colors I want slowly rather than go too far quickly. I'll speed this step up so you can see it. And can you guess what comes next? Yep, you wait for that layer to dry again. And finally, it's time for our actual third step, which is to move on to the mountains. And first, we need to mix up our colors. We need to first mix up a very dark pigment. This isn't going to be our first layer, but we need to make sure we reserve what our darkest color is going to be. I want a dark blue that's muted. To mute a color, use the color on the opposite side of the color wheel. So if we take blue, that's orange. And I think I want a little bit of more depth to it. So I'm going to keep working on this color until it's both very pigmented as well as the actual color I want it to be. Once I have that color, which is achieved by testing on a test piece of paper over and over again until you're happy with the actual color, then we're going to do a very similar thing we did with the gradient. We're going to put a few drops of water in the pot next to the color we just mixed, and we're going to add just a few drops of pigment to that water. We want to start with a very light layer. When you think about the mountains at this time of day, the very back ranges almost are not visible. They're so light that we want to start there. So we're going to go ahead and we have a really dark color that we're not going to touch until the very last step of this. And then we have our very translucent blue mixed up next to it. You'll fill your brush with the translucent blue and then decide where you want your mountains to start. You want to hold the brush very lightly and kind of drag them up and down, filling in each area as you go. You want to make sure the bottom area where you're painting stays wet, and you want to hold this at an angle. And you want to remember that mountains are very irregular, so there might be peaks, valleys, it might be rugged, and then you need to pull that pigment all the way down to the bottom of your painting and then suck up the excess water after drying your paintbrush. Can you guess what we do next? That's right, you get to wait for this layer to be dry again. While you're waiting for the first layer of mountains to dry, what you want to do is slightly darken your light color. I always retest. I put a little bit of the paint on my test strip and then I add so that I've got a direct comparison of what my last layer was to what my new one was. And you don't want this to be hugely different, but you do want it to be a little bit darker, not too much darker, because we will build on the last layer and therefore no matter what it will darken, but having it a little bit darker will help. So I get that right, and then we're going to go on and move to the next layer of mountains, and we want to make sure that all the peaks on these fall below the previous layer. Again, we wait for that second layer of mountains to dry and we mix up our slightly darker color again. You can repeat this step as many times as you want to add more foreground layers of mountains. So I'm going to speed up through my remaining layers so that you can see the final product. Okay, so here is where I'm leaving mine. This is before the tape has been removed. You can see a little bit better of the gradient and the different mountain layers. And then the next step that you absolutely need to do is you need to deactivate the adhesive on the glue using something like a hair dryer before you try to peel that off, otherwise it's going to tear the corners of your paper. Once you remove the tape, you're going to have a beautiful border around your painting. It's almost reminiscent of like an old-timey snapshot. And that's how you make a really fun mountain silhouette painting. It's fairly basic to do. It's a great practice for some different watercolor skills. The hardest part is the waiting to dry. Let me know if you try this. I'd love to see some pictures. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. If you're local to Northern Colorado and would like to take a class, visit rebelunicorncrafts.com to see my class listings. If you'd just like to see what I'm up to, visit my Instagram at rebelunicorncrafts, or if you'd like to see my art, you can visit my other Instagram at LaceyWalkerArt. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a magically creative day.